It was 3:14 a.m. when the red phone at the nursing station rang. In the ICU, we call it the bat phone. It usually means a multi-vehicle pileup or a mass casualty event is
I know
inbound.
how this looks, but you have to listen to me.
But tonight,
They're coming.
it didn't mean trauma. It meant politics. I was standing over bed 4, adjusting the PEEP settings on a 14-year-old boy named Leo, when the double doors swung open. It wasn't the paramedics. It was Dr. Vance, the hospital director, wearing a tuxedo under a hastily thrown-on white coat. But if I lowered it, his oxygen saturation would drift down from a tenuous 92% into the hypoxic 80s, and his heart, already tired and irritable, would begin to throw PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, warning shots across the bow of cardiac arrest. I smoothed the damp, dark hair back from his forehead. He was sweaty, a clammy, fever-broken sheen that smelled of sickness and baby soap. His eyes were taped shut to protect his corneas from drying out, his mouth forced open by the bite block and the plastic endotracheal tube that snaked down his throat, bypassing his vocal cords. He looked like a broken doll, discarded and reassembled with plastic tubing and adhesive tape. At the nurse's station, Maria, the charge nurse, picked up the red phone. I watched her through the glass wall of Leo's room. Maria was 60, a woman carved from granite and cynicism, a veteran who had survived 3 hospital mergers, 2 pandemics, and a dozen changes in administration. She listened, her face impassive, her hand hovering over the census board where we tracked bed availability with color-coded magnets and dry erase markers. I saw her lips move. No. Then a pause. We are diverted. Another pause, longer this time. Her expression shifted from standard night shift annoyance to a rigid, mask-like neutrality that chilled me more than the air conditioning. She hung up the phone slowly, not with the usual slam of a wrong number or a refusal of transfer, but with a delicate, terrified precision, as if the receiver were made of glass. She looked up and met my eyes through the glass partition. She didn't signal a code. She didn't wave for the trauma team to assemble in the bay. She simply looked down at her desk and began to shuffle papers, a gesture of avoidance I had never seen her make in 10 years of working the trenches together. The double doors at the far end of the unit swung open with a violence that startled the unit clerk, sending a stack of charts sliding to the floor. I expected the yellow and black turnout gear of firefighters, the smell of diesel exhaust and antiseptic, the chaotic energy of a gurney crashing through the threshold with a paramedic straddling a patient doing chest compressions. Instead, I saw a tuxedo. Dr. Gregory Vance, the hospital director, strode into the ICU. He had thrown a white lab coat over his black tie attire, but it did nothing to hide the shimmering silk lapels or the slightly crooked hand-tied bow tie. He didn't smell like the hospital, that pervasive mix of bleach, betadine, and sickness. As he passed the open door of bed 4, the draft carried his scent to me, expensive single malt scotch, cigar smoke, and a sharp, acrid sweat. It was the scent of a man who had been pulled from a gala, a man whose night of schmoozing high-net-worth donors had been interrupted by a catastrophe he couldn't spin with a PowerPoint presentation. Vance was a surgeon by trade, a vascular specialist who was once brilliant before he traded his scalpel for a spreadsheet 5 years ago. He had retained the God complex inherent to his specialty, but lost the calluses and the empathy. His hands, once famous for their delicacy in repairing aortic aneurysms, were now soft, manicured, and currently clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He didn't look at me. He didn't acknowledge the unit clerk, who was staring at him with her mouth open, or the respiratory therapist, David, who was checking a nebulizer in bed 6. His eyes locked instantly on the ventilator beside Leo's bed. The rhythmic whoosh hiss of the bellows was the heartbeat of the room, and Vance looked at it with a starving man's intensity. "Nurse," Vance said. His voice was clipped, carrying the ragged edge of someone trying to simulate sobriety through force of will. "We have a VIP inbound. Add 4 minutes. Senator Thorne's son, single vehicle collision, respiratory distress. I need a bed and I need a vent. Now." I kept my hand on the ventilator screen, instinctively placing my body between the director and the boy. The request was absurd. It was a violation of protocol so severe it bordered on hallucination. This was the ICU, not a hotel. You didn't just need a bed, You needed a triage assessment, an admission order, a transfer of care. He smelled like expensive scotch and panic. It was 3:14 a.m. when the red phone at the nursing station rang, slicing through the sanitized equilibrium of the night shift. In the architectural anatomy of the intensive care unit, sound behaved like a contagion. It was usually contained, dampened by acoustic ceiling tiles, the hum of negative pressure vacuums, and the constant rhythmic exhalation of high-efficiency particulate air filters. You needed a patient who met the criteria for critical care. "We are at 100% capacity, Dr. Vance," I said, my voice low but firm. "Every light on the board is red. We've been diverting ambulances to St. Mary's in the next county for 3 hours. We have a pending transfer for bed 9, but the transport team won't be here until shift change at 7. Vance stepped fully into the room. The space was small, crowded with infusion pumps, dialysis machines, and the oversized recliner where Leo's mother, Elena, usually slept. She was gone for the moment, likely in the family waiting room down the hall, taking advantage of the quiet hour to shower or pray in the chapel. The room felt suddenly suffocating with Vance inside it. He sucked the oxygen out of the air. "I'm not asking for a status report," Vance snapped. The fluorescent lights reflected off his patent leather dress shoes, which looked obscenely shiny against the scuffed, dull linoleum that was stained with years of floor wax and betadine spills. "I'm giving you an order. Bypass diversion protocols. The senator's son is coming here. This is not negotiable." "We physically do not have a ventilator," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden tachycardia hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I gestured to the hallway, where the other glass doors revealed rows of occupied beds, each tethered to a machine. "Every machine in the house is in use. NICU, PICU, SICU. They're all tapped out. We borrowed 2 from the ED an hour ago for the overdose in bed 2. It's flu season, doctor. You know this. We are running on fumes." Vance didn't look at the other rooms. He didn't care about the overdose in bed 2 or the post-op cabbage in bed 3. He walked up to the foot of Leo's bed. He picked up the heavy plastic chart hanging from the hook. He didn't scan the vitals. He didn't look at the latest arterial blood gas results, which showed Leo was barely compensating even with maximum support. He didn't look at the nursing notes detailing the struggle to keep his fever down or the terrifying drop in his platelets that signaled the onset of sepsis. He flipped past the medication logs, past the progress notes, straight to the back page. The demographic and billing sheet. "Medicaid," Vance muttered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Indigent, single-parent household, no supplemental coverage." He looked at the address. "The Flats," he said, naming the poorest district in the city, an area of crumbling tenements and industrial runoff that the city council usually ignored until election year. He slammed the chart closed. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Extubate him." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The hum of the refrigerator, the beep of the infusion pumps, the distant chatter of the ER radio. It all vanished into a ringing, absolute silence. I gripped the side rail of Leo's bed so hard my knuckles turned white. I felt the vibration of the mattress, the tiny tremors of the boy fighting the machine for air, his life measured in the mechanical pulses I was guarding. "Excuse me?" I asked, praying I had misunderstood, praying that the scotch on his breath was a hallucination, that this was a test of my competency or my ethics. "You heard me," Vance hissed. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. Up close, the alcohol was overpowering, masking the stale scent of fear that radiated off him. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated, darting around the room as if looking for witnesses, or perhaps for a way out of the trap he had built for himself. "Senator Thorne's son is the priority. This kid, he's been on the vent for 3 weeks. Look at him. He's wasted. He's plateaued. We are allocating resources based on viability. We need the equipment for a patient with a higher viability score and a father who just approved the zoning permits and the funding for our new oncology wing. Leo is 14, I said. My voice was shaking now, rising in volume. Through the glass, I saw Maria stand up at the desk, her face pale. She didn't move to intervene. She was watching, paralyzed by the hierarchy, by the pension she was 2 years away from collecting. He is conscious. He is terrified. but he is fighting. His inflammatory markers were down this morning. His chest X-ray showed clearing in the right upper lobe. If I pull this tube, he loses recruitability. He drowns in his own fluids within 20 minutes. That is not triage, doctor. That is active euthanasia. That is murder. Don't you dare quote ethics to me, Vance snarled. But the shrill, analog trill of that specific landline bypassed the acoustic dampeners. It cut through the sterile hum like a scalpel through fascia. We called it the bat phone. In the hierarchy of communication within a Level 1 trauma center, it was the apex predator. It was the direct, hardwired line from county dispatch. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into the tender flesh above my nitrile glove. His grip was wet and hot. This hospital runs on money, not good intentions. We are $10 million in the red this quarter. If Thorne's son dies in my ER waiting room because you were feeling sentimental about a charity case who's going to die anyway, you won't just lose your license. I will bury you. I will sue you for negligence. I will claim you missed a critical alarm. I will make sure you never work in a healthcare facility again. I will destroy your life. He leaned in, his spittle hitting my cheek. Extubate him. Put him on a high-flow nasal cannula. If he crashes, code him. Go through the motions. But get that ventilator sterilized and ready for the VIP. You have 4 minutes. I pulled my arm back, breaking his grip. My skin burned where he had touched me. You're asking me to kill a child to save a donor's son, I said. There's no medical justification for this. Leo is ventilator dependent. He fails the weaning parameters every morning. His PUF ratio is less than 100. The senator's son is in respiratory distress, Vance countered, his voice smoothing out, adopting the cadence of a grand rounds lecture, a horrifying mimicry of clinical detachment. He is a salvageable 22-year-old male. This boy, he gestured dismissively at Leo, has multi-organ involvement. It's a resource allocation decision. It happens in disasters every day. Tonight is a disaster. Tonight is a car accident, I spat back. And you are drunk. Vance's face went rigid. For a second, I thought he might strike me. The veneer of the hospital director slipped entirely, revealing a desperate, cornered animal. He looked at his Rolex, Epas, a heavy gold anchor on his wrist. 3 minutes, he said. Do it or I call security and have you escorted out for insubordination, and I do it myself. And then, when the review board meets, I will testify that you refused to treat a critical patient. I will sign the affidavit myself. I looked down at Leo. His eyes were open. The sedation had been lightened for a neurology check earlier in the shift. We had been trying to assess his mental status, trying to see if the prolonged hypoxia had caused brain damage. He couldn't speak because of the endotracheal tube snakes down his throat, taping his mouth into a permanent, tragic grimace. But he was lucid. He was listening. He had heard every word. He looked from Vance's flushed, angry face to mine. His eyes, dark and glassy with fever, held a terrifying intelligence. They weren't the eyes of a child anymore. They were the eyes of someone who has seen the machinery of the world, the cold, transactional nature of adults, and realized it is indifferent to them. Tears began to pool in the corners, sliding down his temples into his hair, wetting the pillowcase. He knew. He understood the transaction taking place above his head. He understood that his life was being placed on a scale against a donation check and found wanting. He was poor, he was sick, and he was in the way. I won't do it, I whispered. I will not kill this boy. Then get out of my way, Vance snarled. He reached for the keypad on the ventilator screen. He was going to do it himself. He was going to hit the standby button, silence the alarm, and rip the tube out with his own shaking, drunk hands. He wouldn't use suction to clear the airway first. He wouldn't reassure the boy. He would just yank it like a weed. I should have tackled him. I should have screamed for security. I should have thrown my body over the child. But in that frozen moment of systemic shock, the hierarchy of the hospital, the ingrained obedience to the white coat, the fear of the director, the conditioning of a decade of following orders, paralyzed my motor functions. The threat against my license, my livelihood, flashed before me. I was a single income. I had a mortgage. I had student loans. Vance held the keys to my existence, and deeper, darker than that, I knew if Vance did it, it would be violent. It would be a slaughter. I blocked his hand. Fine, I lied, the word tasting like bile burning my throat. Fine, I'll do it. Let me sedate him first. Don't let him die terrified. Give me that dignity at least. Vance hesitated. He looked at the machine, then at the door. He checked his watch again. You have 2 minutes. The ambulance is at the bay. He turned his back, pacing into the hallway to watch the doors, smoothing his tuxedo jacket, composing his face into a mask of professional concern. Its cry usually meant that steel had met flesh at high velocity, a multi-vehicle pileup on the I-95 corridor, a structural collapse in the old industrial district, or a mass casualty event that would turn our controlled chaos into a war zone. It triggered a Pavlovian cascade of adrenaline in the staff, a specific physiological tightening of the chest, and a dilation of the pupils that every triage nurse knows intimately. It was the sound of impending havoc. He began shouting orders at the unit clerk to prepare an admission packet for John Doe, the alias used for VIPs to protect their privacy. I was alone with Leo. My hands were trembling so violently I dropped the vial of propofol. It clattered on the linoleum, rolling under the bed. I didn't chase it. I grabbed another from the Pyxis machine loaded in my pocket. I looked at Leo. The fear in his eyes was absolute. It was the primal terror of a drowning animal. He was shaking his head, a microscopic movement against the pillow, fighting the restraint of the tape. No. Please. No. I leaned close to his ear, my mask brushing his cheek. I could smell the faint scent of the baby shampoo his mother used to wash his hair, a scent she said reminded her of when he was a baby and safe. I'm so sorry, Leo, I whispered, my voice breaking, shattering. I'm so sorry. I won't let it hurt. I promise I won't let it hurt. I pushed the sedation into his IV port. White milk of amnesia. Propofol. The velvet hammer. I watched the monitor. His heart rate, which had spiked to 140 during the argument, began to slow. The ragged fighting rhythm of his breathing smoothed out as the drug hit his brainstem. His eyelids grew heavy. The panic faded into a chemical twilight. He blinked once, looking at me with a question I couldn't answer. Why? And then his eyes rolled back. I silenced the alarms on the monitor. I hit the standby button on the ventilator. The bellows stopped. The whoosh hiss died. The silence was deafening. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. It was the sound of a contract being broken. I reached for the tape securing the tube to his face. My fingers felt numb, detached from my body. I felt like I was watching a movie of someone else doing this. This was a violation of every oath, every instinct, every shred of humanity I possessed. I was the executioner. Vance was the judge, but I was the one swinging the axe. I deflated the cuff that held the tube in his trachea. I pulled the tube. It slid out with a wet, sucking sound. A long plastic snake covered in mucus. Immediately, the physics of his illness took over. Without the positive pressure of the machine, the fluid in his lungs rushed into the air spaces. I heard the crackle, the wet rails, even without a stethoscope. It sounded like Velcro tearing inside his chest. It was the sound of alveolar collapse. Leo gasped. Even under sedation, his brainstem recognized the suffocation. His chest heaved. I slapped a non-rebreather mask on his face, cranking the wall oxygen to 15 liters, the maximum flow. It hissed loudly, a futile gesture. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I stared at the monitor. His oxygen saturation, which had been holding at 94% on the vent, began to plummet. Percent, 82%. Machine, now. Vance snapped his fingers from the doorway. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at the equipment. He looked at the barcode on the side of the ventilator. I looked at Leo one last time. He was unconscious, but his body was fighting, his ribs retracting with every desperate attempt to pull air through the fluid. He was drowning on dry land. I disconnected the circuit. I unplugged the power cord. I dragged the ventilator away from the dying boy. I rolled it into the hallway, the wheels squeaking on the floor. It felt heavy, like I was pushing a coffin. Just as I cleared the door, the double doors at the end of the unit burst open. Two paramedics flanked a stretcher, moving with urgency, but not the frenetic energy of a code. They weren't doing compressions. They weren't bagging the patient. They weren't shouting vitals. On the stretcher lay a young man in his early 20s, Julian Thorne. He was wearing a ripped polo shirt stained with something that looked like wine, not blood. He had a cervical collar around his neck, but he was thrashing, combative. He was screaming at the paramedics to get their hands off him. He wasn't hypoxic. He wasn't cyanotic. He was pink. He was loud. "My dad is going to sue you," the VIP screamed, his voice clear, resonant, and unmistakably oxygenated. "I just wrecked the Porsche. I'm fine. Get this thing off my neck." He tore at the cervical collar, ripping the Velcro. Vance rushed over, his demeanor shifting instantly from tyrant to obsequious servant. He placed a hand on the stretcher, running alongside it. "Get him sedated, secure the airway, precautionary intubation. We can't risk swelling from the airbag deployment." I stood there, frozen, gripping the handle of the stolen ventilator. The senator's son was drunk. He had a broken wrist, judging by the splint, and a bruised ego. There was a small laceration on his forehead. But tonight, the ring didn't foretell trauma. It didn't signal blood, broken bones, or the jagged geometry of a crush injury. It signaled politics. The unit was suspended in that gelatinous, heavy silence that only exists in the deep watches of the night, specifically between the hours of 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m., the time statisticians call the witching hour of mortality. But his Glasgow coma scale was 14, only lost points for confusion due to intoxication. He was breathing room air at 98%. He didn't need the ventilator. He didn't need the ICU. He needed a detox bed and a cast. He needed to sleep it off. But Vance needed the show. He needed to look like he was saving the golden child from the jaws of death. He needed the senator, who was likely parking his car right now, to walk in and see heroic measures being taken. He needed to justify the phone call that bypassed the diversion. He needed the theater of medicine to cover the ledger of bankruptcy. "Nurse," Vance barked at me, pointing to the VIP's room, bed 1, the largest suite in the unit. "Set it up. Get respiratory in here." David, the respiratory therapist, looked at me. He looked at the screaming Julian, then at the silent, gasping Leo in bed. David knew. His eyes widened behind his glasses. He opened his mouth to speak, but Vance cut him off. "Move, David, or you're fired. And I'll report you to the board for incompetence." David lowered his head. He was a father of 3. He followed the stretcher. I remained in the hallway for a second, caught between two worlds. Behind me, in bed 4, the alarm started. It wasn't the rhythmic beep of a high heart rate. It wasn't the chime of an occlusion. It was the flat, continuous, piercing tone of a crisis. A systole. I turned back to Leo's room. Through the glass I saw the monitor. The green line was flat. Leo's mother, Elena, was there. She must have come back from the waiting room through the back entrance near the medication room. She was standing over the bed, still wearing her coat, a heavy woolen thing that smelled of rain. She was holding a cup of vending machine coffee that she had dropped. A brown puddle was spreading across the floor, mixing with the spilled propofol vial under the bed. She was shaking Leo's shoulders. "Leo? Leo!" She turned to the window. She saw me in the hall. She saw the ventilator next to me, disconnected. She saw the empty space where the machine had been, the void where his lungs used to be. Her face crumpled. She screamed, a sound that wasn't a word, just raw, primal grief that tore through the glass and settled in my marrow. It was the sound of a mother who realizes she has been robbed. It was the sound of the universe breaking. I abandoned the ventilator in the hallway. I let go of the handle. It rolled a few inches and stopped against the wall. I walked back into the room. I didn't run. There was no point in running. The physiology of the situation was absolute. I hit the code blue button on the wall, triggering the overhead page, summoning a team that would be too late. "Move, Elena," I said gently. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from a radio in another room. I physically moved the screaming mother aside. She clawed at my scrubs, sobbing gink, begging me to fix it, begging me to put the air back in him. I lowered the bed flat. I climbed onto the step stool. I interlaced my hands over Leo's sternum. I began chest compressions. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. I was pushing on a chest that had been sacrificed for a photo op. I felt ribs crack under my hands, bones weakened by illness and steroids. The sound was sickening, a dry crunch like stepping on autumn leaves. Every compression circulated the propofol I had given him. Every compression pumped deoxygenated, acidic blood to a brain that was already shutting down. "Where is the vent?" the resident shouted, running into the room with the crash cart. He was young, fresh out of medical school, with fear in his eyes. "Why is he off the vent?" "Director's orders," I gasped out, continuing the rhythm. "Equipment reassignment." The resident froze for a split second, looking at me with horror, understanding dawning on him, then shook it off and grabbed the laryngoscope. "Bag him! Push epi!" The code team swarmed. They pushed epinephrine. They pushed sodium bicarbonate. They intubated him again, sliding a new tube down the throat I had just cleared. The resident struggled. "Airway is flooded," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've got fluid everywhere. Pink, frothy sputum. Suction. I can't see the cords." It was theater. It was a macabre dance of futility. The downtime had been too long. The lungs were flooded. The heart, exhausted and starved of oxygen, refused to restart. The monitor showed a jagged, disorganized rhythm, pulseless electrical activity, and then returned to the flat line. We worked for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of breaking ribs, 40 minutes of pushing drugs into a corpse, 40 minutes of Elena screaming in the hallway where Maria was holding her back. The overhead fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a low amber night mode in the hallways, leaving the patient rooms glowing like bioluminescent aquariums in the dark. The air was recycled, cold, and carried the complex olfactory signature of the ICU, the faint metallic taste of ozone mixed with the phantom scent of old illness, rubbing alcohol, and the distinct earthy smell of a GI bleed 2 rooms down. I was standing over bed 4, bathed in the cool blue luminescence of the cardiac monitor. Elena was chanting in Spanish, rocking back and forth. "Mi hijo, mi vida, por favor, Dios, por favor." "Stop compressions," the attending physician said quietly. He checked the ultrasound. The heart was a still stone in the chest. Time of death, 4:02 a.m. The room went silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans on the useless equipment and the drip of the IV fluids. Elena collapsed onto the floor. She didn't faint. Her legs simply refused to hold the weight of her grief. She curled into a ball, clutching Leo's cold hand, keening into the bedsheets. I stood there for a moment, listening to her. I looked at the boy. I had promised him it wouldn't hurt. I hoped I had kept that promise. I hoped the propofol had been enough. But the look in his eyes before he went under, that accusation, would be burned onto my retinas forever. I stripped off my bloody gloves. I threw them in the biohazard bin. I walked out of the room. The hallway was bright. Too bright. Vance was standing by the VIP's room, smiling. A tall man in a bespoke suit, Senator Thorne, had his hand on Vance's shoulder. The senator looked shaken, but relieved. He was a man who was used to things working out for him. "Thank you, Gregory," the senator said, his voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate you moving mountains for my boy." The paramedics said it was touch and go. They said his airway was compromised. "Anything for family, Senator," Vance replied smoothly. He clapped the senator on the back. "We secured the airway immediately. Precautionary, of course, but you can't be too careful with head trauma. He's stable now. We have him on the best equipment we have. The Servo I is top of the line." I looked into the VIP room. Julian Thorne was asleep, sedated heavily. The ventilator, Leo's ventilator, was standing in the corner. It was plugged in. The screen was glowing. The The bellows were moving up and down in a perfect hypnotic rhythm, but the tubing wasn't connected to the patient. The circuit ended in a test lung, a rubber bag used for calibration, tucked discreetly behind the bed rail. Julian was breathing on his own. He had a simple oxygen mask over his face. The ventilator was just a prop. A $25,000 piece of set dressing to justify a billing code, to justify the diversion override, and to secure a donation. Vance hadn't even intubated him. He had just sedated him enough to keep him quiet and set up the stage. Vance looked up and saw me. He saw the blood on my scrubs. He saw the sweat matting my hair. He saw the hollowness in my face. His eyes were cold, daring me to speak. He gave a microscopic nod, a warning. Remember what I said? I will bury you. He turned back to the senator. We'll need to keep him for observation for a few days. Private room, of course. And we can discuss the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the oncology wing once he's discharged. Of course, Gregory, the senator said. Whatever you need. You saved his life. I looked at the senator. I looked at the sleeping drunk who would wake up with a headache and a story about how he survived a near-death experience. I looked at the closed door of bed 4, where a mother was bargaining with God to return a son who had been traded for a zoning permit. I felt a cracking sensation in my chest, louder and more painful than the ribs I had broken. It was the sound of my vocation snapping. It was the realization that the hospital was not a cathedral of healing. It was a factory. And tonight, it was a slaughterhouse. I walked past them. I didn't make eye contact. Nurse, Vance called out, his voice jovial, performing for the senator. Make sure Julian's vitals are logged every 15 minutes. I didn't answer. I kept walking. I didn't go to the nurse's station to chart the code. I didn't go to the break room to wash my face. I went to the locker room. It was empty. The air smelled of stale coffee and damp coats. I opened my locker and took out my purse. I took off my ID badge, the plastic rectangle that said, Critical Care, Registered Nurse. I looked at my photo, smiling and hopeful from 5 years ago. That woman was a stranger. That woman believed in triage. That woman believed that the hospital was a sanctuary. I dropped the badge into the trash can. It landed on top of a used paper towel. I didn't write a resignation letter. I didn't clock out. I walked out the back exit, past the loading dock where the silver oxygen tanks were stored in rows like artillery shells. It was raining outside. A cold gray drizzle that slicked the pavement and turned the city lights into blurred streaks of neon. I walked to my car, but I didn't get in immediately. I just stood there, letting the water soak through my scrubs, washing away the sweat of the code, but failing to wash away the sensation of the tube sliding out of Leo's throat. My patient was Leo, a 14-year-old boy whose frame had been whittled down to sharp angles and translucent skin by 3 weeks of relentless viral pneumonia that had spiraled into acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. I was adjusting his PEEP settings, positive end expiratory pressure, dialing it up incrementally to keep the alveoli in his lungs from collapsing like wet paper bags. Leo was not just a patient. After 20 days, he was a fixture. The physical memory of it was etched into my fingertips. I looked back at the hospital. It rose into the night sky, a monolith of concrete and glass. From the outside, it looked like a beacon of hope, a place of healing. I knew better. It was a bank. It was a machine that consumed the weak to feed the strong. I still hear the sound of the rain, but mostly, when the nights are quiet, I hear the silence of the ventilator turning off. And I see Leo's eyes, clear and terrified right before the sedation took him, asking me the question I will never be able to answer. Why? Why did his life cost less than a rich kid's hangover? I got into my car and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life. I drove out of the parking lot, leaving the bat phone, the alarms, and the ghosts behind. But I knew they would follow me home. They always do. He was the collection of Superman comics on the windowsill, the rosary beads taped to the IV pole, and the silent, terrifying struggle for oxygen that defined his existence. His chest rose and fell in a forced mechanical rhythm, dictated by the Maquet Servo I ventilator standing sentinel beside him. The machine was a marvel of modern engineering, a $25,000 external lung that was currently doing the work Leo's own body had forgotten how to do. Every breath was a battle of physics. The virus had turned his lung tissue into stiff, non-compliant sponges sodden with inflammatory filtrate. The ventilator had to shove the air in with significant force, holding the airways open against the crushing weight of the fluid. I watched the pressure manometer on the screen. It spiked to 32 cm H2O. High, dangerous. We were approaching the barotrauma threshold, the point where the pressure itself shreds the delicate lung tissue.